With the publication of Two Gun Kid, The Sunset Riders, Marvel had scratched their latest Western itch. Sales of the comic must not have been great, as there was no follow-up at all. Worse, it would be 5 years before they even attempted another Western. In the year 2000, John Ostrander and artist Leonardo Manco dusted off Marvel's old heroes for one last ride. One last blaze of glory. The names of our creative team should ring a bell for long-term listeners of Breakdown. Ostrander wrote several standalone issues of Secret Six, and is perhaps most famous for being one of the creators of the Suicide Squad. He is a super solid writer, and honestly, his name being attached to this project is a big part of what got me interested in buying it. But I normally love Fabian Niciza's stuff too, and Sunset Riders didn't work out too well for me. Leonardo Monco should be another familiar name to longtimers. Monco drew the Doom miniseries from our episodes on Fantastic Four Volume 3, episodes 115 and 116, or 12.24 and 12.25 specifically. His artwork is generally dark and gritty, very sketchy and rough around the edges. Conceptually, I actually think that he is a perfect fit for a Western title, and Ostrander's grounded, slightly darker sense of storytelling. This creative team is a perfect fit for a Western book, at least conceptually, and so I felt super compelled to check this miniseries out. Originally released in 2000, Blaze of Glory, subtitled The Last Ride of the Western Heroes, ran for 4 issues. Ostrander wrote it, Monco drew it, and it was colored by Mariana Monco. When I say colored it, I mean that in the vaguest terms possible. Almost the entirety of this series is washed over with a faded brown tone, like an old piece of parchment. Ordinarily, I would be a fan of this flavor choice, as the presentation would reinforce the idea that this is an old story lost to time. But, well, I'll explain more once we're in. The first issue sets a tone immediately upon opening the comic, establishing that there are 2 versions of the West. One of fact, and one of legend. This story, it says, falls somewhere in between. Ostrander then lays out some basic facts, covering American history from 1876 to 1888. This is done to establish a timeline in the minds of the audience, as let's face it, most of us are not very familiar with American history. The period that we tend to lump together as the Wild West is only about a 30-year period, beginning at the end of the Civil War in 1965 and closing out somewhere in the 1890s. With this refresher course on American history out of the way, Ostrander is then able to introduce us to our stars. And whoo boy, have we got a lot of them. There's a mix of real-world figures like Wyatt Earp, Buffalo Bill, Wild Bill Hickok, and Billy the Kid, men whose lives are as much legend as they are reality. These are people who actually lived in the Wild West era, but their infamy made them legends. Then we have the fictional characters that Marvel created: the bounty-hunting Gunhawk, the Ghost Rider, Caleb Hammer, the Outlaw Kid, Kid Colt, Rawhide Kid, the Two Gun Kid, the Apache Warrior Red Wolf, and ex-slave Reno Jones. By introducing these 2 groups together in the same space, Ostrander is giving them equal weight in our story. In the Marvel Universe, the Two Gun Kid is as legendary and as real as someone like Wyatt Earp. But this also serves to ground the more sensational Marvel characters. This story won't be the bright, squeaky clean, 4-color rated G type of story that Marvel published in the 1950s. This is going to be real. This is going to be painful. This story is going to hurt. My name is Ben, and this is Comic Book Breakdown, episode 19.3, Blaze of Glory. The group shot of these characters is pretty impressive looking. All 13 men are gathered together, rendered with heavy shadows and dark masks and flecks of ink all over the image. It almost looks like an old 1800s era photograph, aged over time. I won't lie, the colorless nature of the image does make it pretty difficult to tell who is who, and this is why I am not a fan of the coloring in this comic. Without the narration boxes identifying the cast for us, I would be pretty lost looking at this splotchy mess. But we do have narration boxes, so huzzah! Having introduced our overall cast setting and our realistic tone, Ostrander then moves us into the story. We open in a small town in southwestern Montana called Wonderment. It was founded 5 years ago when exodusters moved out west and found a winding river that they named Glory. An exoduster, by the way, is a general term given to the first general migration of African slaves after the Civil War. So, this town was founded by ex-slaves looking for peace, happiness, and personal freedom. Over time, more people came, including poor whites, and the town prospered. It is now 1885, and any story that starts with a prosperous, happy town sure isn't going to have one for much longer. 2 kids, one white and one black, are running through the outskirts of town, playing using their fingers as 6-shooters. The white kid, Hubie, claims to have hit his friend with his gunfire, but that child, Cass, argues that he missed. Cass is pretending to be the Rawhide Kid, and ain't nobody can outshoot him. But Hubie is Kid Colt, the fastest gun in the West, and he says that you're dead. The pair begin to shove each other and get into a wrestling match on the ground. This is when Cass's father, a tall, strong, serious-looking man, pulls them apart. They explain that they weren't doing anything, but he takes Cass home anyways. Ma says dinner is ready. On the way home, Pa asks what the fight was about, and Cass explains that there was no gunfighter who could outshoot the Rawhide Kid. Everybody knows that. Pa laughs this up. They're getting their facts from dime novels, and those are mostly made up. They shouldn't take them too seriously. Once inside their small home, Pa pulls a book off of a shelf. Did Cass know that his pa was the subject of one of those books? He reads the title out loud for us. Reno Jones and Kid Cassidy. Gunhawks. Cass starts flipping through the book immediately, asking if this is really about him. Reno downplays the validity of the stories. They're about a man named Reno Jones, sure enough, and they say that man was him. Ma is exasperated by all this. Those stories are for fools. Why is she showing Cass this? Their son ignores this, though, confused. But the story is printed in a book. Doesn't that mean it has to be true? Reno scoffs at that idea. The book said that he was a happy slave. So happy, in fact, that he didn't even know that he was a slave. And his master was so nice and kind, he raised Reno like his own son. When the Yankees burned the plantation down and stole Reno's woman, he joined the Confederate Army to avenge her. And then, after the war, he and his master's son, Kid Cassidy, rode the West like brothers. He laughs, lighting a pipe. Let me tell you what really happened. Reno then relates his life story. He did grow up on a plantation, and he did grow up with the master's son. But as they grew older, Cassidy didn't pay any more attention to Reno than he did the other house slaves. The Civil War broke out, Cassidy went off to fight it, and when he got back, his father had died, and there wasn't anything left to keep him there. There wasn't anything keeping Reno, either. So they did travel the West together for a time, but as they did, Cassidy got more and more bitter and mean. One night he drew on Reno, and Reno shot him in self-defense. He knew that it looked bad, though, a black man shooting a white man, so he booked it, leaving Cassidy lying there. Cass's eyes are wide at this point. You killed Kid Cassidy, Pa? Well, Reno later heard stories about Cassidy, which meant that he would have been alive in order to make them, so maybe he died, maybe he didn't. Did you meet any of the other legends? Cass asks, fully invested now. But Ma is getting tired of this kind of talk. Supper is ready and getting cold. It's time to eat. As the Jones family does just that, we pull out to the wilderness surrounding Wonderment. There, we find a group of 5 armed men wearing white face masks. They wait until the moon is high and then they ride into town. Screaming a rebel yell, the men shoot anyone that they see and hurl torches onto rooftops. The hoods they wear are chosen to remind the ex-slaves of why they left the South to begin with. The goal of these men is to terrorize, to make the Exodusters feel weak and scared. They are called Night Riders. But Reno Jones isn't weak or scared. He takes to the street with his rifle and manages to shoot one of the men, shouting for them to leave. One of the men seems to recognize Jones, and he returns fire. But another Night Rider reminds him that they're doing a hit and run tonight, like in Quantrill. The Night Riders gather their wounded, and they ride out of town. But that would not be their last visit. The raids would continue. The town would burn. Innocent people would be hung in the street or shot like animals. The citizens of Wonderment thought that they had escaped this kind of terror. That kind of fear quickly turns to desperation, we're told, and anger, and soon the town had a meeting about the situation. Reno heads up the meeting, and another citizen says that the thing they need to know is why these attacks are happening. A French-Canadian trapper named Marcel Fournier takes the floor. He says that the Night Riders want them to die or to run. There's something about this land, the land that Wonderment was built on, that they want. So they need to get the populace off of it, one way or another. But what is it about the land, Reno asks? Is it gold? Silver? There's a copper mine not too far away, and that has made its owners rich. An indigenous representative named Flaming Star knows that when the white man sets his eyes on something, nothing can stop him from taking it. After some more discussion, in which they dismiss the idea of contacting the army, the town settles on a rough plan. They're going to hire some guns. Flaming Star knows of one such man, and he'll contact him to see if he'll help. Reno knows of a gunfighter who probably knows others, so he'll start there. And Marcel offers to ride with Reno, because he knows another man who could help them out. And so they set out. The basic setup for our story here is good, keeping Reno at the center of things while still giving us a mystery to solve. Our Night Riders are either disgusting racists, or they are greedy a-holes posing as disgusting racists, or they're both. But why they want Wonderment remains unclear, so that's an interesting background concern. There is something a bit too serendipitous about 3 different men in the town each knowing a gunfighter on their own. Like, what are the odds of that happening? I could see someone having the background necessary for that story element, and Reno's own tale gives us plenty of reason to believe that he might have met a fighter or two in his time. And as a trapper, Marcel certainly has reasons to have traveled and met someone, but he just happens to be in town when this goes down? I don't think that he's involved with this plot, I just think that this is some lazy writing, to be quite honest. Flaming Star, knowing a guy, at least acknowledges the fact that indigenous peoples have a stake in this town and the world at the time. We also have an added layer that Wonderment housed the Nez Perce when the US Army was hunting them down, which is why the Army probably won't help Wonderment now and why they won't bother contacting them. The people of Wonderment are alone in this fight. And those are some good storytelling stakes. The story that Reno shows his son is a very meta story beat. You see, in 1972, Marvel released a new comic called Gunhawk, and it starred Kid Cassidy and Reno Jones, 2 men who grew up on a plantation, but one was the master's son and the other was a slave. They fought in the Confederate Army and after became wandering gunfighters. Kid Cassidy was shot and Reno was blamed for it, and with issue 7, the book was renamed Reno Jones Gunhawk, making him Marvel's second black character to headline his own title. However, the book was also cancelled with issue 7, so Reno's shot at stardom was unfortunately a quick one. So Ostrander is acknowledging that Marvel's old comics existed. Those stories still happened, but they happened in dime store novels within the Marvel universe. Reno's actual real life was something completely different. Ostrander is both honoring what came before, but also changing it in order to fit with the more realistic, grimmer version of the world that he's portraying. If you skipped my Westerns intro episode, a Knight Rider was another name for the Ku Klux Klan, who would wear their white masks and ride around at night, terrorizing people. The Knight Riders that we see here are either using that mythology in order to scare people off, or they're descendants or maybe allies of the Ku Klux Klan. Marcel Fournier is a name that should be familiar if you listened to our last episode. Marcel was a member of the Sunset Riders, and the gunfighter that he's looking to contact is very likely the Two-Gun Kid. Marcel's only appearances in the Marvel Universe are in 1995's Two-Gun Kid and the Sunset Riders, and here, in Blaze of Glory. The odd thing about Marcel's appearance here is that he appears to no longer be black. He also has a very thick, cartoonish French accent, another thing that was not part of the character in Sunset Riders. I'm honestly not sure why the creative team changed his ethnicity or his speech patterns. I almost feel like Ostrander was just given a list of Western characters to include with no context for who they were when writing this. But there are so many other deep cuts that he does get right that him not doing the research on who Marcel Fournier is feels unlikely to me. Flaming Star, for example, is one of those deeper cuts. He dates back to 1967's Ghost Rider issue 1, and is, in fact, the man who gives Carter Slade the all-white Ghost Rider outfit. Slade was later killed in Western Gunfighters issue 7 in 1972, but given the retconning that Ostrander did to Reno and Kid Cassidy, it's possible that we might see the OG Ghost Rider down the line. Ostrander is showing us that all of Marvel's Western history is at play here. The old stuff from the 60s and 70s, as well as the newer books released in the 90s. And I love that. It's super fun to see everything matter, and I got just a real kick out of doing all the research while reading this book. This kind of story is one of the reasons why I love comics. If you are someone who had read those old Western comics, great, buddy. They still matter. They still count. But if you hadn't, you have a whole new interpretation of them to read that stands on its own, and it's great. I wouldn't be hosting this show if I was content to just read the comics and then move on with my life. I love this. On the way out of Wonderment, we see some of the Knight Riders set up in a sniper's nest in the rocky lands surrounding the town. They watch Reno and Marcel leave town, and one of them draws a bead on them. He can drop them from here, he reports. But the other man tells him to hold off. They're headed in the right direction. Out of town. Letting them go will encourage others to do the same. Reno and Marcel do end up visiting an army fort and pleading their case, but they are turned down, sadly, but not unexpectedly. They then split up, agreeing to meet back here in a week with their respective gunfighters. We now jump to a carnival, where we watch a brief stunt show featuring Johnny Bart, the Rawhide Kid. He does a forward dive off of his horse in mid-run, rolls to his feet, and then does a series of impressive target shooting and some quick gun spins. The crowd is impressed, and Bart tilts his hat down in quiet acknowledgement of their praise. Once the show is done, Bart heads to his tent with his horse when a familiar voice greets him. He turns, having drawn a pistol in one smooth motion, and recognizes Kid Colt. Sitting against a fence post is a man somewhere in his 20s, I'd guess. He's blonde with short hair and round sunglasses on. A cigarette rests in one hand. He tells Bart not to say that name too loud. He's got people looking for him. Best if they don't hear it. He stands and compliments Johnny's shooting. He's almost as good as the kid is these days. Bart scoffs at this. He must be slipping if he's only as good as him. The host of the show, Wild Bill Hickok, runs over to Johnny, pleased with how well the show went. But he needs to sell it a bit more, take a bow, something. Johnny apologizes to Bill, but he's quitting the show. Something's come up. A friend of his needs help in Wonderment. Johnny and the kid walk over to Reno Jones. Johnny introduces Reno to nobody, as Kid Colt doesn't want his name spread around, and then he tells Kid his goodbyes. But you know what? Kid Colt figures that he might as well just come along on this trip. And Johnny tells him no. I love it. Kid is so offended at being turned down here. Johnny explains that this situation calls for cool heads, and Kid Colt's got a hot temper. Kid Colt basically tells Johnny to go shove it. If he can't ride with him, then he'll just follow him, and there's nothing he can do about it. And so the three men ride out. Johnny tells Reno that he wired another friend of his to meet them at the fort, but this one ain't quite all right. This is a super economical scene. Ostrander displays Johnny's skills as a writer and a gunfighter, then he also gives us a measure of his personality. He stays to finish the show, as he most likely was contracted to perform, but he also quits once it's over. He is a man of his word, but also a man who values lives and helping a friend over money. Wild Bill Hickok can't believe Johnny when he tells him that he's quitting. He would give up showbiz? The show is what matters to Hickok now, but saving lives and helping a friend matters more to the Rawhide Kid. I enjoyed the banter between Johnny and Kid Colt a lot. It feels very brotherly, with them teasing each other back and forth. I would call this giving each other the business, and it immediately establishes a history and a bond between the two of them. They know each other very well, they're comfortable with each other, and that's just great to see presented on the page. The Rawhide Kid's visual design is perhaps the second biggest departure that we see from the original version in this book. Characters like Reno and Marcel look like your fairly standard Western character. Shirt, pants, a jacket of some kind, a hat to provide shade from the sun, nothing special. But the Rawhide Kid's original design has him in all blue jeans and a long-sleeved blue top with 8 white buttons running down either side of his chest. He used to have bands running along his biceps, he wears white gloves, and he has a white hat and a blue scarf on. He looks a lot more like a superhero than a Western hero, easily standing out in a crowd. But the version that we get in Blaze of Glory looks much less notable or clean. Ostrander's Rawhide is disheveled with long brown hair reaching his shoulders. He does wear a cowboy hat, but it's plain brown, and he wears a long brown coat without sleeves. A pair of gloves without fingers cover his hands, and he just looks like anybody. Despite his showman performance, Rawhide looks like any other hired gun that you could imagine. I can't tell if Johnny told the kid that he could not come along in order to manipulate into him coming along, though. It kind of feels like it. There's a panel with Reno and Johnny riding off, and Reno looks behind him, seeing Kid mounting his horse. He tells Johnny that it looks like he's coming anyway, and then we get a shot of Johnny's face. It's mostly obscured by the brim of his hat, and he's either smiling because he is happy that Kid Colt is coming along, or he's grimacing because Kid Colt is coming along. So I'm not exactly sure of what's going on there, but hopefully we'll learn more about their connection as the story moves forward. Kid Colt's visual reimagining is much less extreme than Rawhide's. Colt normally wore blue jeans, a red button-up shirt with long sleeves, gloves, a white hat, and a white and black vest, most likely cowhide. The bright colors are the only thing that really make him feel like a comic book character, and Monco's artwork largely drains him of that color here. But he is still a blonde young man, he still wears a vest. But this version of Colt wears dirty brown pants, a long-sleeved blue shirt, a brown leather hat and matching vest, with fringe along the chest portion. He also wears circular sunglasses, which, goddamn if they don't look particularly cool to me. The issue ends with a man arriving at Hickok's show asking after the Rawhide Kid. A thick scar streaks across his face, down from his brow, over the bridge of his nose, and down to the jawline on the left side of his face. Well, in truth, he is actually after a tall blonde man who might know Rawhide. He introduces himself with one of many names, this particular one, Lee Barnett. Most people know him as Gunhawk, and the holsters on his hips and the handle of his guns are decorated with golden hawk designs. Hickok confirms that he might have seen the man that he was referring to. He just left with Rawhide. They said something about going to Wonderment, Montana. You a lawman or a bounty hunter? Gunhawk grimaces. A bounty hunter. And it looks like he's going to Wonderment. Which is an exciting, enticing way to end the issue. We saw at the beginning that Gunhawk was listed among our Western legends, implying that he is a good guy. So why is he after Kid Colt? Is he gonna switch sides? Or is he justified in hunting him down? The origins of Gunhawk, or rather this version of Gunhawk, are kind of difficult to pin down. There was a nameless bounty hunter who appeared in 4 issues of Western Gunfighters, who was hunting down characters like the Ghost Rider, the Outlaw Kid, and the Phantom Rider. But little is known about the character. Assuming that this Gunhawk is a reinterpretation of that Gunhawk, it is worth noting that Gunhawk is the only Marvel Comics character created by Jerry Siegel, one half of the team who created Superman. However, there were 2, technically 3, other Gunhawks. One of them was a man named Red Larrabee who, and get this, was a gunfighter out to avenge his father. Once he did, he traveled the West, hunting down outlaws and earning the name Gunhawk. He appears to have starred in an ongoing series called, creatively, The Gunhawk, which was published in 1950. And, of course, we went on to have Reno Jones and Kid Cassidy, who were both referred to as Gunhawks. Clearly, this interpretation of the name isn't Reno Jones or Kid Cassidy, and given Ostrander's respect for the older stories, I feel like if this character was Larrabee, then we would know it. Ostrander would have said something, or he would have given us some kind of clue. I definitely think that he is using the unnamed bounty hunter here, as Gunhawk's real name is never given, not even in omniscient narration. If I have any complaint about the overall story at this point, it's that Reno Jones immediately feels like a background character once Rawhide Kid is introduced. While Reno was a fair shot and has a greater stake in our narrative, as it's his town that is being attacked, Rawhide looks like a badass, he acts cool and in control, and he can shoot like a mother. This dude is dope. I want to be him. He's everything that you want a cowboy/western hero to be. And so, for me, he just overshadows Reno immediately, especially when we meet Johnny first, and then tie him back into Reno's story. Reno feels like an outside concern here. Rather than Reno connecting us to Rawhide, Ostrander has Rawhide take the lead role, even if only for a few pages, and he just steals the floopin' show for me. But Reno Jones wasn't the only man looking for help. Issue 2 opens up in Anaconda, Montana, where Marcel Fournier is attempting to enlist his own gunfighter. We meet Clay Harder, the modern alias for lawyer Matt Hawk, who has another alias as the Two-Gun Kid. Clay denies his history, arguing that he's put his past lives behind him. Matt Hawk and the Two-Gun Kid are both dead, as we saw in Sunset Riders. But Clay's curiosity about Marcel's story remains. He asks after the other Sunset Riders, his old crew. Marcel basically says that they've all gone their own ways and their current fate is unknown. Much like the Two-Gun Kid, eh? Clay promises to use his contacts to look into why Wonderment is under attack, but that's the best help that he can offer. Marcel gladly accepts it, and tells him to send any information he finds to Fort Thunder. In 4 days, he's going to meet with Reno Jones there. As Marcel leaves, Clay stares after him. Then he goes to his desk drawer and pulls one open. Inside of it are 2 pistols. Wait, hang on. Let me do that again. Inside it are 2 guns. Ah, yeah. Seems the 2-gun kid isn't quite dead yet. The Sunset Riders are an obvious nod to the last Western series that Marvel published, which we covered last episode. Even if those characters aren't going to be present in this story, which is a bit of a shame in my opinion, I do love seeing their existence acknowledged at least. It's a good way to show the validity of that particular comic and establish Clay's history within the world here. It's also a cool way to hint that while Clay is trying to move on from his past, he hasn't quite let go of it yet. So the reveal that he still has his guns and outfit feels right. Like with the other Western heroes, 2-Gun Kid's appearance here is an update and a combination of his overall history. The first 2-Gun Kid to be published was named Clay Harder, who appeared back in 1948, with Matt Hawk being introduced in 1962. Originally, Marvel tried to fit them both into continuity by having Clay's stories in dime novels inspire Matt, so it was more of a mantle being picked up kind of thing. But Ostrander just simplifies all of it. 2-Gun's real name is Matt Hawk, but when he retired from gunfighting, he took the name Clay Harder. Simple and clean. The concept of Clay Harder inspiring Matt Hawk to take up the name 2-Gun, being a dime-stored book character, is also the same thing that we see with Reno Jones, whose real-life stories were adapted into adventure stories. And again, that's a really cool metatextual conversation that Ostrander is having here, with these old 1950s comics being updated for a 2000s audience. In the hills outside of Wonderment, in the cool night air, we see Flaming Star. His granddaughter, Ghost Wind Rider, has followed him, and he berates her for doing so. It is not safe here for a woman. She argues that if it isn't safe for her, then it isn't safe for him either. 3 outlaws suddenly surround them, stepping out from the woods. They eye Ghost Wind Rider hungrily, eager to have some fun. But a voice says that they won't be having any fun tonight. A strong pair of hands suddenly grab one of the men, yanking them back into the shadows. A staff smacks another one in the head, and the third is down by a thrown tomahawk. The assailant picks up his weapons, but remains low to the ground, hunched over like an animal. He wears buckskin pants, a wolf pelt over his head, and has some sort of bead decoration on his chest. Next to him is a snarling gray wolf called Lobo. Flaming Star called for Red Wolf, and he has come. Ostrander gives us a Cliff Notes history of Red Wolf, saying that once upon a time he did fight for peace between the white man and the red, but he has come to understand that the white man's hunger knows no bounds, and so he fights them. Stories say that he aided the Nez Perce in their flight to Canada, and that he died defending them. But you can't always believe the stories. Flaming Star then explains the situation in Wonderment, but after hearing about it, Red Wolf is fairly unconcerned. If the white man is killing other white men, let him. They are not their people. But Ghost Wind Rider argues otherwise. Wonderment has given food and shelter to their people before. They are their friends and allies. They can't just abandon them now. Flaming Star apologizes for her outburst, but Red Wolf takes it in stride. Her passion sparks something in him that he hasn't felt in a long time. He will help them, but in his own way and his own time. He offers to take care of the bodies so that no other whites will find them. He then picks one up and begins to pull him into the shadows. But one of them is not dead yet, Ghost Wind Rider notes. Red Wolf's almost dead eyes stare out beneath his wild pelt. He will be. This is a badass scene, and it almost works as well as the one that we get with the Rawhide Kid for me. But there is one major key difference between the two of them. That being that we're told that Red Wolf is missing his heart. He's given up on fighting for acceptance and peace. Now he fights only to kill. When Ghost Wind Rider argues for helping the people of Wonderment, her passion, her heart, is what touches Red Wolf. He remembers being like her once before, but then he leaves, promising to kill a man in cold blood, the memory fading. To be fair, Ostrander makes sure to imply that these men would have, at least, murdered Ghost Wind Rider and her grandfather, if not also raped her. They are not good men, and we are not meant to feel bad for them. We're meant to feel bad for Red Wolf, who's lost so much of himself that his only concern is killing his enemies. And these days, his enemies are pretty much white men. Red Wolf is our wild card. He is this series' Wolverine. He's got his own motivations, he's a deadly terror when he's able to use stealth, and he can kill 4 men in the time it takes to say that sentence. He is absolutely an asset in this battle, but he also ain't gonna play by your rules. There have actually been several different Red Wolves throughout Marvel's history. The original, who is also Marvel's first indigenous hero, first appeared in Avengers issue 80 in 1970, a long way from Marvel's Western comics. Stan Lee kinda just fell in love with the idea of the character, and so another Red Wolf debuted in Marvel Spotlight, whose real name was Johnny Wakely. This is the version of Red Wolf that we see here. Johnny Wakely is Red Wolf's adopted name. As a child, he was taken in and raised by a white couple in the 1900s. His parents were killed by indigenous peoples, a greedy land baron burned his house in an attempt to kill him and steal his land. This led to Wakely joining the U.S. cavalry, but he was shunned by his fellow soldiers because of his ethnicity. On a scouting mission, Wakely's party was ambushed by indigenous warriors, and he ran. Stumbling into the burial site of the warrior known as Red Wolf, Wakely is contacted by a Cheyenne god named Owayodata. Given the ceremonial garb of Red Wolf, and paired with the Wolf Lobo, Wakely became the new Red Wolf and fought to promote peace between the white man and the indigenous peoples. Clearly, a lot has changed for Red Wolf between his older appearances and his appearance here in Blaze of Glory. So we've now seen the results of Reno, Marcel, and Flaming Star's recruitment drives. Now let's see what those people are up to. In Anaconda, lawyer Clay Harder visits the offices of Riley Mining as a representative of Wonderment. Mr. Riley smiles over his desk, a fat cigar held in one thick hand. Why, there is no such place, he replies. At least, there won't be in a month. So you're aware of the attacks then? Harder asks. Riley isn't aware of any attacks, he is just stating simple facts. Harder finally cuts the polite crap. He knows that Riley used to be the masked outlaw called the Tarantula. He also knows that he's behind the attack on Wonderment. What he doesn't know is why. Riley leans forward. There's a river that runs through that valley. He's going to build a smelting factory there in order to process the ore that comes out of the mountains. Getting riled up, he then stands. He's learned from his past mistakes. He's going to make his fortune like Carnegie and Morgan did, legitimately. And if Harder gets in his way, then he'll be sure to remove him as well. Clay Harder leaves the office without even glancing at the traffic as he crosses the street. When he enters his office, he immediately pulls open his desk drawer and takes out a leather domino mask. Maybe the two-gun kid died too soon. Once more, Ostrander is pulling from Marvel's Western history here. Clay Riley was a masked gunfighter called the Tarantula, and he appeared in Ghost Rider Volume 1 a couple of times. This is a fun nod to past continuity, but it is also an interesting growth for one of these characters. Men like Rawhide and Two Gun are finding themselves left behind by the times, relegated to gun shows, or running from their past. But Riley has moved on, without moving on, really. He's still a crook, he's still a thief, he's just hiding it behind the veneer of being a businessman. When he says that he's doing business like Carnegie and Morgan, he is referring to Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan. Carnegie made his fortune as a steel industrialist, but there are rumors that he and his fishing club were responsible for the destruction of a dam, which caused the Johnstown flood that killed 2,209 people in 1889. J.P. Morgan was dubbed, during his lifetime, a robber baron by the newspapers and had his own share of problems. His Northern Securities Railroad Company was deemed illegal under federal antitrust law, the first such action by the national government. He was also investigated by Congress for his control of the financial markets, and his company, U.S. Steel, was forced to relinquish its monopoly. So reinventing Riley along these lines is a really clever move, in my opinion, if kind of a poorly timed one. Carnegie and Morgan would not have had their public scandals yet. We were told that this story was set in 1885, and the flooding of Johnstown didn't happen until 1889. This is one of the problems with establishing a hard timeline for your work of historical fiction. If your research is off or incomplete, you can create plot holes like this one. The trade-off is that if your audience is largely ignorant of history, well, then you can get away with this kind of thing. But if I'm ignorant about history enough that I don't know who Carnegie and Morgan are, then I'm also missing your point here. So either we're making stuff up or we honor history. You gotta pick one. At Fort Thunder, Marcel joins Reno, Rawhide, and Kid Colt. He reports that the man he was hoping to recruit, who we know as the Two-Gun Kid, is dead. A rider then approaches them, a young brunette wearing leather clothing. He asks after the Rawhide Kid. He is Lance Templeton, and he is hunting the Outlaw Kid. Rawhide sent him a message saying that he knows where to find him. Kid Colt leans over to Rawhide. "But isn't he?" he whispers. "He is," Rawhide replies. "I'll explain later." He then shifts his attention to Lance, telling him that the Outlaw Kid will be in Wonderment, Montana in a few days. They're headed that way now, if he wants to join them. Lance agrees, but he needs to swap out his horse. He'll meet them here, just give him half an hour. As he rides off, Colt and Rawhide give us Lance's background. You see, Lance is the Outlaw Kid. He took the name in order to keep his father from finding out that he was a gunfighter originally. When his father did find out, the shock of it killed him. So Lance split that part of himself off, blaming the outlaw for the death of his father. So now he's hunting himself. This is actually 100% consistent with Outlaw's original version, although the identity split wasn't quite so pronounced back then. Colt questions the wisdom of having him along on this run, but Rawhide is hopeful for it. The outlaw is a solid shooter, if they can get him to come out. Who knows, maybe this whole thing will straighten out Lance's head. They can hope. A voice suddenly shouts Kid Colt's name. We turn and see three men, armed on horseback, staring at our cast. Their leader is a mustachioed man. He is Caleb Hammer, a Pinkerton agent, and he has come to arrest Kid Colt. The rest of our cast, Rawhide, Reno, and Marcel, all draw on him. They have a use for Kid Colt, so they're gonna need him to back off. Hammer holds his gun up. That's fine. He has hunted Colt for this long. He can go a few more days. Colt snarls. Hammer's been tracking him for a year now, and he's sick of it. Why not just end it now? He fires off 2 shots, hitting one of Hammer's backups in the head and winging the man himself. Another shot downs the third man, and Rawhide swears. He knew that Colt's temper was trouble. Those men had their guns up, damn it! Now they need to ride before the authorities show up. The men all climb onto their horses, and they book it. They ride past Lance on their way out of town, who shouts after them. Rawhide shouts back, "If he's gonna follow, then he best do it quick!" Lance follows, and the group rides until sunset. When Rawhide and Colt have a moment alone, Rawhide asks him what's changed. He's always had a price on his head, but Pinkertons? And shooting them in the street? Colt has always been a hothead, but he isn't normally stupid. Colt admits that the price on his head did go up, since he shot that sheriff. This surprises even Rawhide. Colt normally isn't an outright murderer. He'll kill bad people, sure, but a sheriff? Before they can get further into it, Colt draws a pistol and takes aim as Two Gun approaches their camp, hands held up. Rawhide is surprised to see him. He honestly thought that he was dead. Two Gun smiles. He was. He got tired of it. Marcel then chimes in that this is the man he sought to recruit. Two Gun then explains to our cast who is after Wonderment and why they want it. The situation is bad, for sure. Riley has the money to hunt them all down for years to come, if he so chooses. And if they help Wonderment, he will hunt them down. So the group decides to make a final decision when they reach the town about what they're going to do, and see things for themselves. Marcel promises that he can sneak them in a back way. Caleb Hammer is another deep cut, appearing only once in Marvel Premiere issue 54 in 1980. Even there, he was a Pinkerton agent, famous for his dedication to not kill the men he was hunting. Westerns, as stories in general, are very famous for having their lawmen killed indiscriminately, let's say, and Hammer was an attempt to go against that trend. I think it is also important to note that most superheroes don't kill, and given that Hammer debuted in 1980, superheroes were the order of the day. Making him a law-abiding lawman fit the storytelling trends of the time, and he adds an interesting wrinkle to our already pretty crowded narrative. The next day, we see our back way into Wonderment, a narrow stone bridge over a waterfall. Only one man and his horse can pass at a time, and yes, of course, it is pretty slippery. Marcel demonstrates its general safety first, and then Rawhide follows. Finally, only Reno and Lance remain. Lance has blanched at the sight, though. He can't do this. Reno offers to walk him across and then come back for his horse. All Lance has to do is try. But he shakes his head. He can't. Reno stares at him. You know, the outlaw kid could cross this bridge. Suddenly, Reno is shot in the shoulder. His horse bolts across the bridge and he falls into the water. Gunfire explodes at the feet of our cast. They draw their guns and open fire in every direction they can. Across the bridge, Lance knows that he can't help, and then he pulls a bandana up over his nose. Lance Temple can't help, but the outlaw kid can. And on that cliffhanger, almost a literal cliffhanger, actually, issue 2 ends. We still haven't had our full cast gather yet, but we haven't entered our third act either. That's when we're going to see everybody group up and finally act as a unit. We also have the death of Reno Jones. And again, it's hard to care about it because he's been so overshadowed at this point by the rest of the cast. Rawhide is really the one wrangling our various cast members, and Colt's personal and personality problems kind of take center stage this issue. Add in the split personality thing that Lance has going on, and this cast is just sadly more interesting than Reno has been. and they're all much more comic booky than a regular man defending his home. So when Reno dies here, I can't help it. I just kind of shrug. Which is lame, as he's the first character we really meet and got to know in this book. I hate the fact that I feel this way, but it's where I am. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Blaze of Glory is basically the Magnificent Seven, but set in the Wild West of the Marvel Universe. Nothing about this feels very Marvel, other than some of these characters having slightly over-the-top personality quirks. After all, this book has no ties to modern continuity, modern characters, or modern concepts at all. It very much feels like a Western movie or series, and that's great, as so far I'm really enjoying this book. Do I wish that Reno Jones had a bigger role? Absolutely. But Reno fills the role of the villagers of the Samurai Seven, the Mexican peasants, who hire the cast of the Magnificent Seven. Yeah, the Magnificent Seven movies are retellings of the samurai classic, The Seven Samurai. It's great. So Reno, in theory, isn't really a character in this. He is a plot device. He got us into this mess, and now our cast of characters has to get us back out. How they do it is the interesting part, and I'm definitely interested. This is a lot of fun. Next week, our heroes finally make it to Wonderment. They're betrayed by one of their own, they're joined by a ghost, and the blaze goes out. Join me in a week for Comic Book Breakdown, episode 19.4, Blaze of Glory, Part 2. Everyone, there are a million podcasts vying for your time and attention, and I'd like to thank you for listening to mine. If you would like to get in touch with me to share a concern, request a series, compliment me, berate me, whatever you like, send me an email at cbbreakdown@gmail.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening.